Out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh, and we're going to finish off Isaiah chapter 14 in this episode. This is part of my ongoing series on the book of Isaiah. If you want to start from the beginning, I have a whole playlist on that. This is a channel where we look at the Hebrew Bible in the context of history and archaeology and linguistics. And our previous episode, we covered most of chapter 14, and we are in verse 24, where we have the beginning of an entirely new oracle. If you consider this section of Isaiah known as the oracles against the nations, you'll see that the oracle against Babylon, which started in chapter 13, went on through most of chapter 14 until our location here on verse 24, whereas now we're going to take up an oracle against Assyria. However, this one does not use the word Massa to describe it. It is never referred to as a burden against Assyria. But then, starting in verse 28, there's going to be another reference to an oracle, and this time it is going to actually say that it is a Massa, and that is going to be a little different than the other ones. Usually it says it is a Massa against a particular nation. This one, it simply says a time frame of when this was given, that it was in the year that King Ahaz died, that we get this final Massa of chapter 14. And then as we go on to 15, we'll go on into further oracles against Moab and so forth. But as we look at verse 24 through 27 and verse 28 on through the end of the chapter here, these are two separate oracles that follow on after the oracle on Babylon, covering Assyria and then the Philistines. And so we jump right in here to verse 24. The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be. As I have proposed, so shall it stand. And so we have the Lord introduced in his military title here, the Lord of hosts, and telling us that his plans will come to pass. It's very straightforward. And then in verse 25 here, we have that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot. So not only are we told that Assyria will be broken, but it is something that will happen in his own lands, presumably the land of Israel. And then he gives us this nice little chiasm here, and shall depart from them his yoke, and his burden removed from their shoulder. This honestly isn't as easy to see in translation. I kind of like it a little bit more in the Hebrew where you can see it, but if you look over here, you'll see both the English and the Hebrew to get an idea of how this chiasm works. It's a nice little chiasm here talking about the removal of this burden. Moving on to 26, this is the purpose that is proposed concerning the whole earth. And this is the hand that is stretched out over all nations. And we have here a nice little cognitive accusative here, the purpose that is proposed or the plan that is planned. Also the idea that it is concerning the whole earth. The word here for earth is eretz, which is the very common word for earth. But then we repeat these ideas of proposal and hand being stretched out in this final verse of this. For the Lord of hosts has proposed, who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? And so we have a nice little A-B with a repeated A-B pattern here in these verses. And that's really the entire oracle against Assyria. And it doesn't tell us much of anything specific or new. There are much more detailed prophecies about Assyria elsewhere in Isaiah. And it leaves us kind of wondering, why was this here? It doesn't say anything specifically new. And it's almost like they wanted to include Assyria in this section in some way. But it's not entirely clear why and why they didn't choose one of the more detailed and elaborate prophecies against Assyria. Some have suggested that maybe the entire oracle against Babylon was originally against Assyria and it was only later edited to be against Babylon. That's a possibility. It would have required a few edits, but it is somewhat generically against Babylon. It doesn't give a lot of detailed historical context, and certainly the part in chapter 14 that we recently covered gives no historical context at all. It could be about any tyrannical king. But we have this just brief section here on Assyria that's inserted, and it's not entirely clear what purpose this serves. It's very straightforward. It doesn't give us a lot of any new information that's not covered elsewhere in Isaiah. But there it is. Moving on to verse 28, we now have an oracle against the Philistines. Now, verse 28 itself, there is a little bit of confusion. Does it belong to what follows or what comes before? It is possible to interpret verse 28 as an ending of the oracle against the Assyrians. However, the overall context seems pretty strong that this should actually be tacked to what follows, because it talks about the death of King Ahaz. That's very simple. In that year that King Ahaz died, came this oracle, or this burden. This is our word Massah that this section is known for using. It's unlike the others where it normally says a Massah against a particular nationality. Here it just gives us a time frame of when it happened. And because it is associated with the death of King Ahaz, it looks like that is what should follow here, because that seems to follow the theme of what we're saying to the Philistines. And that would make more sense than tying it to what comes before. Also, every one of these introductions has preceded the oracle and not followed it. But every one of them has also had a slightly different format. And this is the only one that has this unique format here. So that's not really possible to be conclusive on. Anyway, moving on here, it says, "Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken." It's telling them not to rejoice because the rod they were being beaten with is broken. Now, one of my favorite translators, Robert Alter, tries to tie this to the death of the king of Assyria, and that makes some sense since this is tied in there with that previous part where we're talking about Assyria. If you want a strong connection of this section with the section immediately before it, then perhaps the death of an Assyrian king would feed into this, but I don't agree on this one. I think this is a separate issue here, and that we've started a completely new section here as we talk about the introduction of this Massah here, and that this is not about the death of an Assyrian king, but the death of King Ahaz. The fact is, all of these nations fought against each other quite a lot, and the Philistines and the Israelites were never exactly friends. And so here, telling Philistia not to rejoice because the rod that struck you is broken after you just announced the death of King Ahaz seems like those two are more strongly connected. And so this is telling the Philistines not to be rejoicing because King Ahaz is dead. And I think that is the more logical interpretation of what we're saying here. But then comes the great part here, that for from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. So the obvious implication here is, if you thought you were getting a break because the old guy is gone, wait until you see this new guy. And it seems to fit well with Isaiah's view of Hezekiah. So in this chapter, we've had Satan compared to a bright, shining star, and a righteous Davidic king to a serpent. So Isaiah likes to defy expectations. The word translated here as fiery serpent is the Hebrew word saraph. And you may recognize seraph as the same word that is used in chapter 6 to describe divine beings, that the ones with the 6 wings that Isaiah sees in vision, same word as this. Here it is understood to be a fiery serpent. There it is understood to be a divine messenger. The root word, saraph, means to burn. And so the word is applied to both of them. The fire serpents get their name probably because of the effects of the venom that they carry, whereas the divine messengers, because of the glory of their presence, although there is plenty of speculation that they may be more linked than that, that they may be that the angelic beings were somehow seen as snake-like, and that they were flying snakes. this is interesting here that Isaiah adds the word flying to describe this. And so it is not just a fiery serpent, but it is a flying fiery serpent. And only Isaiah does this. When we describe the fiery serpents back in the Torah, where they come among the people and they make a brazen serpent so that people can look on it and be healed, they just simply refer to them as fiery serpents. But Isaiah adds here the power of flying. Now, this, of course, logically, we could be talking about the majestic beauty of a snake striking, could very easily be thought of as flying. However, the idea of winged snakes is also something that we do see in the ancient world. So it's impossible to know exactly what he meant here by adding flying to it, but flying was generally considered a remarkable power. And so this is the idea that this is going to be something magnificent here, that from the serpent's root is going to come forth an adder, and its fruit is going to be this flying, fiery serpent. If we think of this as Isaiah, we're saying that he is going to be a far greater and more powerful king than Ahaz was, and be someone who can dominate the local political scene in much greater ways than Ahaz was ever able to pull off. And will graze in my pastures the poor, and the needy lie down in safety. Nice little chiasm there, and we'll explain some of how that translation comes about. But I will kill with famine your root, and your remnant it will slay. Remnant and root are a sound play in Hebrew, as they are in English, with sharesh and sha'ar. And we have two little chiasms here that form verse 30. The translation here, and will graze in my pastures. The traditional text has bakore, which means firstborn of. And it says here, will graze the firstborn of the poor, which doesn't make a lot of sense. What are the firstborn of the poor, and why are they grazing there? But we have multiple Hebrew manuscripts that have a different spelling here, that have bacharai, which is in my pastures. And that makes much more sense with the verb graze here. And so I think that pastures is the correct word to have here. So, and will graze in my pastures the poor, and the needy lie down in safety, has this idea that this powerful king coming is going to give rest to the poor and the needy. And this is part of why this fits much more with Hezekiah than it does with a new Akkadian king. That this king that's going to be so powerful and will dominate the Philistines will also give comfort to the poor and the needy. And so this appears to be a righteous thing. But I will kill with famine your root, and your remnant it will slay, says that it will not be a good thing for the Philistines, that there will be famine that they will have to deal with. And we continue that warning against the Philistines here with this next little 3-line A-B parallelism here. Wail, O gate, cry out, O city, melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you. For smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks. The idea that smoke is coming from the north makes it sound like something's happening there. Maybe it's a cloud of smoke or dust that is the sign of a vast invading army. It is hard to say why smoke coming from the north is the problem. Coming from the north is interesting because really Jerusalem was more to the east than to the north, but it was somewhat to the north of the main Philistine homeland. And certainly the Assyrians would have been thought of as coming mostly from the north as they descended down into Israel. So it really could be just about anything if we're saying coming from the north as to who it's referring to. But there is no straggler in his ranks. The Hebrew is somewhat obscure, and there are some odd textual variants. The word that is translated as ranks here is moadim, which generally means the appointed time. And so it's a bit of a stretch here as to how we translate this. There is no appointed time in his forces. Yeah, it's a little creative. The Dead Sea Scrolls has a variant spelling also but it doesn't clear up much. And we still have a little trouble figuring out exactly what this line is referencing here that's going to cause them to melt. In the previous verse, we had said it was famine. Now, maybe it's war. It does seem to be indicating some type of an invading army, some type of a war that's coming. And then we have this interesting verse that we ended in here with verse 32. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. We have a question to start off with here. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? Some variants have plural there, messengers of the nations, plural. Some have singular. But who are these messengers and from what nation? Well, it's not clear at all. Maybe they're the ones coming from the north. Maybe not. What follows here appears to be the answer, that the Lord has founded Zion. The implication here is that there is a new founding of Zion. This would agree with the idea that there will be a renewal of power and of the Judean kingdom under Hezekiah. And in her, the afflicted of his people shall find refuge. Seems to go back to this idea that the poor and the afflicted will graze there. And so the idea is that Zion will be a refuge for those who are underrepresented in society, who are the poor and the afflicted, that it will become this place where people can flee to. And so as the Philistines themselves face famine and possibly war, what will they answer these messengers that come to them? And we're not sure who those messengers are. Well, the answer is going to be that there is a new Zion and that it is a place where the poor can go to find refuge. And so that's it for chapter 14. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, please like and subscribe and hit the bell icon, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.